Well, good evening and welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study as we get back into studying the Old Testament. Today, we're going to look at the book of Numbers. I asked this last week, but I'll ask it again. And we didn't really focus on Numbers last week. But when you think of the book of Numbers, does anything stand out to you? Anything that you remember about the book?
Talked a lot about the people.
Okay.
Facts and figures.
Facts and figures.
Caleb.
Caleb. Joshua. Okay.
Balaam.
Balaam. Yeah. There's that very interesting story. Balaam and his talking donkey. Well, most people just...
Wait, when the earth opened up, that was...
Okay. So, the book of Numbers is one of the books a lot of times we kind of skip over. It's kind of an in-between book. It comes between the Exodus event and it comes kind of this journey of the wilderness. It's kind of another way of thinking about the book. You know, if you had to rename it. The Numbers comes from the idea that there's a census at the beginning and a census at the end of the book. But the majority of the book itself, the narrative part of the book, is the story of the wilderness. So if we think about the Exodus, the book of Exodus, and then we had Leviticus, which when we talked about Leviticus is what are the practices and the ways that we're going to structure our worship and our life together, and kind of the idea of how are we going to make things that are going to be clean and unclean. All of those kind of things were in Leviticus. And then you move to Numbers, and it's from the Exodus event now, after Sinai, where do we go on our way to the Promised Land? So we kind of pick up at the beginning of Numbers, and essentially they stay at Sinai for about 2 years. And during that time is when they begin to build their society, essentially, the Israelites. They are grouping themselves up. They are building the tabernacle. They are building the tent. They're building all of these things that are going to go with them through the wilderness. They are also putting structure into place about their worship. And by the time we get to the first part of Numbers, they are already remembering the Passover as they're getting ready to go towards the Promised Land. So it's the continuation of the story, but we kind of frame the story. The beginning of it is a census of the first generation, and the end of it is the census of the second generation, the generation that will inherit the land. And what we see is that those two generations kind of break up the narrative flow of the text. The first generation are the generation that are unfaithful. They're disobedient. And they're the ones that get stuck. The other generation is the faithful generation. And they're the ones that will move into the Promised Land. One of the other themes that we'll see, and we'll talk a little bit more about, is kind of the theme of journey. Throughout the narrative, we'll see that God, through the cloud, is leading the people through the wilderness. And they are following. God goes ahead, they follow. God goes ahead, they follow. Sometimes they follow very well. Other times they don't follow so well. We'll also see some other things within the story of Numbers as well. One of the things I want us to think about, and we have to go back to our conversations, the historical background of Genesis and Exodus and even Leviticus, and think about when was Numbers written down. So the question becomes not when did these stories originate, but when did it finally get written down? And what was the purpose of it finally getting written down the way it is today? So we talked about in our first class when we talked about Genesis, most biblical scholars would say that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, didn't officially get written down the way we start to have it today until exile. So much, much later. There were oral traditions. There was written down. Parts of it were probably written down in different fragments in different places, but they weren't compiled until later. And the problem of why it was written down becomes this question of, in exile, if we don't write these stories down, will they be remembered for the next generation? Y'all remember talking some about that? So what we have here is a group of people who are living outside of Israel in their own wilderness with a desire to what? To go back home. They're on their own journey. Why are they there? Well, the prophets would say it is because the former generation was unfaithful. So how are we going to get back home? We've got to be faithful. So in many ways, the book of Numbers, as it is in its final form, is in many ways a sermon to a group of people who are displaced from home. That's one way we might think about it. You know, they're looking back at their history and saying, there was another generation like us, whose parents knew about God, had experienced God, and yet when God would offer them to be strong and courageous, they chose the easy way out. When God gave them the temple and all the things for worship, they chose other things. And that's why we're here. That's the way some of the prophets would have said it. You have forgotten who you are. So this generation in exile, as they begin to write down the stories so that the next generation doesn't forget, one of the themes throughout it is a theme of, even when you're displaced, even when you're going through a wilderness experience, God is always preparing a way home, a way back to the promises of God's promised future. And it may not be this generation that gets there. It might be the next one. Parts of the book of Numbers, the beginning parts of the book of Numbers, is really kind of a structuring of Israel itself. What is this tribe going to do? What is that tribe going to do? It is almost a sense of planning the camp, planning the group before their travel. So we're not going to go into a lot of the detail as we read through it. That's for you to kind of go back and read over some of the stories in Numbers if you'd like to. A lot of the Levitical census, a lot of the groupings, a lot about who's going to do what and where, and some of the various laws. But one of the things we see in chapters 1 through around 9 is a lot of priestly and Levitical structuring and codes for living. Let me just kind of read a few of those as I pull them up here. Chapter 5, verses 1 and following. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Command the Israelites to put out of the camp everyone who is leprous or has a discharge, everyone who is unclean through the contact with the corpse. You shall put both male and female, putting them outside the camp. They must not defile their camp, where I dwell among them." The Israelites did so, putting them outside the camp as the Lord had spoken to Moses. So the Israelites did. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelites, when a man or a woman wrongs another, breaking faith with the Lord, that person incurs guilt, shall confess the sin that has been committed. The person shall make restitution for the wrong, adding 1/5 to it, and giving to the one who has been wronged. If the injured party has no next of kin, whom restitution may be made for the wrong, the restitution for wrong shall go to the Lord for the priest, in addition to the ram of atonement," and so on. What we see here is some of the priestly and some of the various laws that are being asked of Israel is very curious in that many of the things that we read in Leviticus now get put into practice within the overall community of faith. Last week we asked some questions about different things about remembering, how we remember the story of God. And some of the things as we go back to, we read, it's interesting that oftentimes there's a lot of things you cannot do. There's very rarely an explanation of why. I want you to think about, why couldn't you eat some foods, clean foods, and not eat other foods?
Somebody said one time it was God's way to protect the human body from disease because he knew the dirtiness of some animals. I don't know. Or it could have just been God saying, follow my words.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see how you do.
Yeah.
Kind of like a test.
Kind of like a test.
Some of it was the, like predatory versus the grass feeding, chew cut animals. So it's like, stay away from the, I don't know how you, it's blood and.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting that, and I think I mentioned it last week, but we didn't record it or anything, but there was an anthropologist did a study one time about other societies, and they decided they wanted to go back and read some of the Levitical laws and see if they could figure out why certain things were the way they were. And one of the things that one of them wrote, and we can take it with a grain of salt because the Bible doesn't explain certain things, but that the priestly tradition goes back to the story in Genesis, where God creates an ordered reality. You got day and night, you got dry land and water, you've got seasons, you've got all the things that make for order. And oftentimes the things that are viewed as clean fit into that ordered reality. But the things that are unclean are often things that move from one space to another space. It might move from land to water, or water to land. It may have a different way of locomotion than regular kinds of animals. You know, many of let's say the things that come out of the ocean are not necessarily things that can stay in the ocean. They can come out and they look more alive than dead. Those are unclean. A pig can live in land or it can live in mud. So there's these kind of, one way of thinking about it is that the things that are in the ordered reality are good, and things that are disordered become questionable. They represent in many ways the chaos to which God is going away from. So when we get to things like leprosy, people that have a discharge, people that have touched a dead body, you know, we would say today, why you wouldn't allow certain people in society. I mean, you know, somebody from Sea Rights couldn't come to church with us. Their job was to take care of what? The dead. Mm-hmm. But they're going from a living to dead. They're kind of breaking boundaries that Israel says, these are not boundaries that we feel comfortable breaking. They go outside the ordered tradition, the ordered reality. So when we see these sorts of things happen, it goes from clean and unclean to now wrong and right. When you have wronged somebody, that breaks ordered reality. When you go back to the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, 5 onward, honor mother and father onward. When you disrupt those kind of things, it starts to break down what? The community. It starts breaking down the ordered community. And what God is asking in the Decalogue is to order your reality in the way that God would want you to. First, putting God first, resting, and putting others above your inclinations to break that reality. I mean, if I start lying and stealing and murdering and cheating, it's going to cause some disruption. And the reality is, this group of Israelites are a tribal society at this point, and they've got to move from point A to point B together. And if they don't live in some sort of ordered reality, things start to what?
Just break up.
Yeah,
breaks down.
fall apart, yeah.
Breaks down. One of the things we'll notice in Numbers, and one of the things that we see throughout the narrative of Numbers, is that Moses and then Aaron are trying to regulate this ordered reality. You've got the priest like Aaron, and then you got the Levites who are helping to maintain the religious institution of the tent of meetings, the tabernacle, the sacrifices. And that's part of the early parts of the chapters, is kind of this, the worship part of Israel. And then you got Moses, who's trying to lead the people from point A to point B. And as much as they're trying to make a people cohesive within the body of the people, what are they trying to do? They're trying to jockey for position. They're trying to complain about what things are happening. So as soon as we start seeing God order reality within Israel, we go back to the story of the ordered reality of the garden. And within the garden, what? Everybody wants to be like God. Or they want to be like Aaron. Or they want to be like Moses. And as that happens, the ordered reality of Israel itself starts to what? Break apart. To the point that God gets so frustrated that He won't even let them go to the promised land. He waits for the next generation. Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden. So we see some of the same themes within the Genesis story, within the story of Exodus, beginning to resurface itself. I always look for thematic kind of cycles within the biblical text, because we see this even in our lives. As we read the book of Numbers, we would ask, as followers of Jesus, how do we read the book of Numbers today? As we journey with Jesus, where do we see ourselves in these stories? The book of Numbers, we talked a little bit about last week, has some of the varied traditions of genre and literature in it itself. You've got narrative, you've got poetry, you've got prayers in there, you've got cultic and civil regulations and laws, you've got things that go like a census list. I mean, most of us wouldn't just sit down and start reading a census list.
Not unless we were looking for a specific name.
Specific name. But Numbers has so many different kind of categories of composition, of literature within it. And then it has different sources that the compilers of the story, the written story of Numbers, have put together. And I don't know if I want to go through all of that right now. What I'd like to do is just start reading through parts of Numbers. And I want us to kind of think about it in terms of some major themes within the narrative of Numbers. The first major theme is journeying. So God has liberated a people from Egypt, has brought them out to the Mount Sinai, and has given them a law, and has given them an order of how are they going to relate with God, how are they going to relate with one another. And He's promised that He's going to take them to the land that He promised to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But they've got to take a journey with God to get there. It's a journey story. It's the journey story will get retold again in some of the Psalms. Some of the Psalms will look back at the book of Numbers, and this wilderness journey is going to be an important, because the psalmists will write about their generation as being oftentimes like this generation. The prophets will look back at the generation of, and kind of take some of the same themes of God's people not getting to where God has wanted them to be. We even get to the book of, say, like Hebrews. And the book of Hebrews looks at an early church who is struggling to stay faithful to Jesus. And we'll go back to this story and say, don't be like that generation. So as we kind of think about the book of Numbers, a lot of times we think of it and we don't really, it's not a book we connect with a lot. And we're not going to spend a ton of time in it, but I do want you to think about some of the major themes of Numbers is embedded within the rest of the biblical text. I mean, this is a very important story that God has freed a people, liberated a people, chosen a people, given them a new identity, give them a calling, and even with all of that, they still aren't able to follow God the way that God calls them to. And the temptation for Christians today is to sometimes turn backwards. That's what the book of Hebrews is all about. It's a book that is encouraging an early church to stay faithful to Christ. Let's skip over the first couple of chapters. If you'd like to go and read those, you've got the first census, you've got all the kind of the Levitical codes and some of the laws and some of the ways that they explain some of the worship and different things. Let's go to chapter 9, and we get the Passover. We already hear about the Passover in, I believe it's Exodus chapter 12 or somewhere in there. After the Exodus, there's a little break, and then we hear that after this has happened, Israel is to remember this every year. But in Numbers, we get the actual practice of the Passover. So let's look at chapter 9, verses 1 and following. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. So it's been 2 years. And they're just camped out at Sinai. A lot of times we think they just keep moving quickly.
They just stayed there.
They just stay there, and it takes time to structure this. Essentially, they're creating a new society.
And you can't just go to the local store to get supplies either. You gotta wait for them to grow. I guess.
Let the Israelites keep the Passover at its appointed time. On the 14th day of this month at twilight, you shall keep it as it is appointed time. According to all its statutes and all its regulations, you shall keep it. So Moses told the Israelites that they should keep the Passover. They kept the Passover in the first month on the 14th day of the month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai. Just as the Lord commanded Moses, so the Israelites did. Now there were certain people who were unclean through touching a corpse, so they could not keep the Passover on that day. They came before Moses and Aaron on that day and said to him, although we are unclean through touching a corpse, why must we be kept from presenting the Lord's offering at its appointed time among the Israelites? And Moses spoke to them, wait so that I may hear what the Lord will command concerning you. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelites, saying, any one of you or your descendants who is unclean through touching a corpse, or is away on a journey, shall still keep the Passover to the Lord. In the second month, on the 14th day at twilight, they shall keep it. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall leave none of it until morning, nor break a bone of it according to all the statute from the Passover. They shall keep it. But anyone who is clean and is not on a journey, and yet refrains from keeping the Passover, shall be cut off from the people for not presenting the Lord's offering at its appointed time. Such a one shall bear the consequences for the sin. Any alien residing among you who wishes to keep the Passover to the Lord shall do so according to the statute of the Passover, according to its regulation, and you shall have one statute for both the resident alien and the native. So after that, we get a little bit more of the... So Israel is asked at the beginning of their journey, before they are to leave, to remember. To remember the Passover meal. Last week, we talked about, how and why do we study our Bible. And I think, at least personally, one of the reasons we do it over and over again in our lives, one of the reasons that we come to it is so that we aren't like the wilderness generation who forget. When we go back over and over again, we remember the story of God who has come into a world, who created a world good, and who is rescuing a world from brokenness and sin. Jesus tells his disciples, remember me when you break the bread and drink the cup. The fourth commandment says, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. It is through practices that people are able to remember as a community. So Israel is asked to remember the Passover meal every year. Not only are they to remember it, they are to essentially reenact it. And for those that may think that they're not able to do it because they're unclean or whatever, they're not a native, God says even for them, it is important to remember this story. So when we get to the New Testament and we come to things like Jesus asking us to remember, part of it is because if we don't, the next generation won't remember either. The more we do this, the more the story is told and retold. The more the story is lived out. And we can only imagine the book of Numbers hearing it in exile and practicing the Passover meal when you're living under the bondage and the rule of the Babylonians. And you're telling a story about a God who liberated God's people out of the hands of Pharaoh. That's formative and shaping and gives hope to a people that are far removed from home. So they're asked to remember the Passover, and we can come back to that maybe later as we think more about it from a Christian perspective. After that, it says, on the day the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle. The tent of the covenant from evening until morning, it was over the tabernacle, having the appearance of fire. It was always so. The cloud covered it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. And whenever the cloud lifted from over the tent, the Israelites would set out. And in the place where the cloud settled, there the Israelites would camp. And at the command of the Lord, the Israelites would set out, and at the command of the Lord, they would camp. As long as the cloud rested over the tabernacle, they would remain in camp. Even when the cloud continued over the tabernacle many days, the Israelites would keep the charge of the Lord and would not set out. Sometimes the cloud would remain a few days over the tabernacle, and according to the command of the Lord, they would remain in camp. Then, according to the command of the Lord, they would set out. Sometimes the cloud would remain from evening until morning, and when the cloud lifted in the morning, they would set out. Or if it continued for a day and a night, when the cloud lifted, they would set out. Whether it was 2 days or a month or a longer time, that the cloud continued over the tabernacle, resting upon it, the Israelites remained in camp and would not set out. But if it lifted, they would set out. At the command of the Lord, they would camp, and command the Lord, they would set out. Very repetitive. But I want you to get the visual image here, is that God, through the cloud, was showing them not only His presence, but where to go. So this visual image of this journey story of Israel from Sinai to the Promised Land is based on God's presence over the tabernacle, showing the people where to go. God's presence was with them and leading them. So here's the thing we have to remember, because we don't experience it in this way today, is that God visually showed them His presence. I mean, oftentimes we think about the theophany of Sinai and Moses goes up to the mountain. By this point in Israel's history, God's presence has come down from the mountain and is with the people, showing them where to go. Even still, they will complain and argue and not trust.
And how many people are we talking about again? Quite a few, right?
Yeah, quite a few. You'll have to go back to that census. I don't know I mean, you can kind of gather, yeah.
That's, yeah.
Yeah, and it's, I mean,
As many times as I read it, I never really.
it's a large number.
People,
I mean,
one area.
yeah, there's, I mean, we'll see one story where it'll say that, you know, when the other people saw the Israelites, they couldn't even see the ground. There were so many of them.
603, 550 at the end of the first census.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. It's probably exaggerated numbers. I mean,
When I was young and read the Bible, I just thought it was a handful of people. I did
Yeah.
not realize until you get.
well,
and you
yeah.
read it again, and then you catch those numbers. But it's like, there was a lot of people.
And you've got to, you know, with this kind of imagery that Numbers gives us is, you know, when things aren't going well, one or two people who are in charge have a hard time.
They did.
I mean, we think about just a regular church, you know. Good Christian folks can argue about some silly stuff.
I know.
So, you know, you think about trying to lead a nation.
Sorry, Jeremiah.
You're fine. You're trying to lead a nation out to a promised land that, I mean, once they get there, it's not like it's built up. There's people living there.
I thought Sinai was just all desert.
Well,
Have you been? Did you go?
no.
No.
No. So,
I flew across the Sinai a few times. It's pretty much a lot of desert.
Yeah.
But there are tribes out there, even today, that live in the desert.
so it's in the peninsula. So you do have some water somewhat, you know, I mean, it's a little farther, but, you know, Mount Sinai's, you know, here at the end of the Sinai Peninsula. So they've left Egypt, gone to Sinai, and it's really not that far to get here. Yet, because of their unfaithfulness, they're going to be kind of just circling the wagon for a long time.
It's a long walk in 120-degree heat.
Yeah, it is, but it's only right here. This is a 100-mile length
It's
here.
not a 40-year walk.
No, it's not a 40-year walk.
No.
That's 100 miles. So from here to here, it's only a couple hundred miles.
I could probably done it in a couple of years.
I mean, that many people, yeah, I mean,
5 miles a day time.
a year, 2 years at
That
most,
large
maybe.
crowd is probably like trying to herd cats.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to go, you know, their own little walking path and whatnot.
You gotta remember, they gotta pull up their lodges, their tents and everything.
Yeah,
Pack
and
them
their
up and
goats
start,
and
yeah.
all that stuff, yeah.
I can't even imagine.
So let's turn over to chapter 11, and we'll start some of there's a series kind of back to back, a handful of them, and then we'll kind of look at maybe one more story. It's a stories of complaints. So let's look at chapter 11. Now when the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes, the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled. Then the fire of the Lord burned against them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. But the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire abated. So that place was called Terabah, because the fire of the Lord burned against them. The rabble among them had a strong craving, and the Israelites also wept again and said, "If we only had meat to eat." Sounds like me. "We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at." So God has provided manna for the people in the wilderness, a food source. God gives just enough that they can have extra. Just think about, what's your favorite meal?
Italians.
Italian.
Me? Oh gosh, I like chicken.
Chicken.
Ice cream.
Ice cream.
Mexican. Just think, whatever your favorite meal is, what if you had to eat it every day of your life?
He did that when we were first married. He says, I don't see why we can't just have spaghetti every night. After a week of it, he says, I see we should have chicken once in a while.
Yeah. I mean, you can have your favorite thing over and over again, and after a while,
You get tired of living your favorite.
you start to think about the things you want. Now, what they were given was enough to keep them alive. It was enough to keep them moving.
He gave them their needs.
He gave them their needs. But most of us, if we're honest, we can have our needs met, but our appetites are what drive us.
Because after your chicken, you want the ice cream, cake if you got it.
Yeah. So they have a false memory. When we were in Egypt, we had plenty of fish to eat and all these other things. Now we got to remember, life was hard in Egypt. They were being overworked. It's a false memory. Yeah, they may have had that meal once or twice, but it wasn't like they had it every day. So the question becomes, when God is providing for us, how are we like the wilderness generation? How are we like Adam and Eve? The very thing we don't have is what we want. And you start to complain. Y'all have heard complaints. We hear them at church all the time. Well, the other church, they're doing this or they're doing that. Why can't we have? Why can't we do? Israelites, the same way. Your children used to do that. Probably some of them still do. Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its color was like the color of gum resin. And the people went out and gathered it, ground it in meals, or beat it in mortars, and boiled it in pots, and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. And when the dew fell on the camp in the night, the manna would fall with it. Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, all the entrance of their tents. So you can hear, I can only imagine it is like today. A handful of people start complaining, and complaint spreads, doesn't it? I don't know what it is about complaints, but when you hear one, some reason you just take it on and want to share it with somebody else. I never thought of it that way, but you're right. You're right. So Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you treated your servant so badly? Why have I not found favor in your sight, that you have laden the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive this people? Did I give birth to them, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom, as a nurse carries a suckling child to the land you promised an oath to your ancestors? Where am I to get meat to give to all of this people? For they come weeping to me and say, give us meat. I am not able to carry all this people alone, for they are too heavy for me. If this is the way you're going to treat me, put me to death at once, if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my misery." So Moses, he's had it. I mean, God, you're the one that brought them out. You're the one that's providing for them. I'm the one getting the complaints. You need to take care of this, or just let me go. Even Moses has gotten kind of the complaint syndrome here too, doesn't he? So the Lord said to Moses, "Gather me 70 of the elders whom you know to be elders of the people and officers over them. Bring them to the tent of meeting and have them take their place there with you. I will come down and talk with you there, and I will take some of the spirit that is on you and put it on them. And they shall bear the burden of the people along with you, so that you will not bear it all by yourself." God begins to what? Delegate a little bit of responsibility away from Moses. "And say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat, for you have wailed in the hearing of the Lord, saying, if we only had meat to eat, surely it was better for us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not only 1 day, or 2 days, or 5 days, or 10 days, or 20 days, but for the whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you and have wailed before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? But Moses says, the people I am with number 600,000 on foot, and you say I will give them meat, and they may eat for a whole month. Are there enough flocks and herds to slaughter for them? Are there enough fish in the sea to catch for them? And the Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's power limited? Now you shall see whether my word shall come true for you or not. So God says, all right, I'm going to delegate some responsibility. Also, I'll give them some meat. I'm not going to give it for 1 day or 2 days or 3 days, 4 days, or for a week. I'll give it to them for a month. I'll give it so much that they're going to eat it till it comes out their noses. I'm going to get it till they are sick to death of it. And you see God just a little bit angry here. Moses hears what God's saying, but he doesn't get it. His concern is, how are we going to get that much? Where are we going to get all this meat? You're going to promise them meat. Where's it going to come from? So Moses went out, told the people the words of the Lord. He gathered 70 elders, placed them all around the tent. The Lord came down in the cloud, spoke to them, took some of the spirit that was on him, put it on the 70 elders, and when the spirit rested upon them, they prophesied. But they did not do so again. 2 men remained at the camp, one named Eldad, the other named Medad, and the spirit rested on them. And they were among those registered, but they had not gone out to the tent. So they prophesied in the camp. And a young man ran and told Moses, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. And Joshua son of Nun, the assistant of Moses, one of his chosen men, said, my lord Moses, stop them. But Moses said to them, are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his spirit on them. And Moses, the elders of Israel, returned to the camp. So there's a little side story here about 2 men who the Spirit of the Lord falls upon and they begin to prophesy. It's very similar to the story in Mark's gospel, where the disciples come and say, there's other people doing stuff in your name. Go tell them to stop. And Jesus, I believe it's in Mark 9, says, no. They're doing it in my name. It's okay. Very similar here to that story. The wind went out from the Lord and brought quails from the sea. So we know that it's at the peninsula. They come up from the sea. Let them fall beside the camp, about a day's journey on the side and a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, about 2 cubits deep on the ground. So the people worked all that day and night, and the next day gathering the quails. And at least anyone was 10 homers. They spread them out for themselves all around the camp. But while the meat was still beneath their teeth, before it was consumed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. So that place was called Kibroth Hattaavah, because they were buried the people who had the craving. For Kibroth Hattaavah, the people journeyed to Hazeroth. So the people get the quail, they begin to eating, and as soon as it touches their lips, God just, he'd had enough. While they were at Hazeroth, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. For he indeed married a Cushite woman. And they said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has not the Lord spoken also through us? And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very humble, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth. And suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron and Miriam, come out, you 3, to the tent of meeting. So the 3 of them came out, and the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forward. And he said, hear my words. When there are prophets among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. Not so with my servant Moses. He is entrusted with all my house. With him I speak face to face clearly, not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. When they were not, why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. When the cloud went away from the tent, Miriam had become leprous as white as snow. And Aaron turned towards Miriam and saw that she was leprous. And Aaron said to Moses, O my Lord, do not punish us for a sin that we have so foolishly committed. Do not let her be like one stillborn whose flesh is half consumed when it comes out of the mother's womb. And Moses cried to the Lord, O God, please heal her. But the Lord said to Moses, if her father had but spit in her face, would she not bear her shame for 7 days? Let her be shut out of the camp for 7 days, and after that she may be brought back in. So Miriam was shut out of the camp for 7 days, and the people did not set out on the march until Miriam had been brought in again. And after that the people set out from Hazeroth and kept in the wilderness of Paran. So here we have another story, back-to-back stories. This one is Aaron and Miriam, Moses' brother and sister, are complaining that Moses has married a Cushite woman. And indeed, we said, indeed, he had married a Cushite woman. He married an outsider. They're just one of the groups out there. Yeah, they're from the land of Cush. I don't know if we have it on here.
Isn't that down towards Ethiopia?
Yeah. Anyway,
It's south.
yeah.
So there's other people wandering around the desert.
Yeah, I mean, just other people.
No, in my, it said that she was Ethiopian.
Ethiopian, Cushite.
basically.
Well, we don't need to think of today's Ethiopia. It's an ancient.
It was,
It was in maybe what the region of Ethiopia would be today, but it's not.
it's not the,
Yeah.
the Ethiopian are today.
Yeah.
It's just basically.
Yeah, it was a tribal group that would have been there. Anyway, she would have been a foreigner. And Miriam and Aaron are upset, and they start complaining, and the Lord gets tired of it. And essentially says to Miriam, be quiet. Not only be quiet, you're going to be removed from society for a while. She's going to be shamed. She becomes unclean. She has to leave camp. She becomes leprous. And what we'll notice in each of these stories, whether it's the people, whether it's his brother and sister, Moses always intercedes for them. Moses is always asking God to relent. Back in the book of Exodus, when the people have made the graven image as Moses is up there, God is ready just to start over. Moses, you'll become a new Abraham. You can have all the nation. Let's just get rid of these. And Moses stands up and says, no. No. Give them a chance. So over and over again, we see Moses as kind of the intercessor within these chapters. Let's look a little bit of chapter 13 and 14, and these are probably more well-known parts of Numbers. So let's listen to this story. The Lord said to Moses, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites from each of their ancestral tribes. You shall send a man, every one a leader among them. So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran according to the command of the Lord, all of them leading men among the Israelites. These were their names. From the tribe of Reuben, Shemamu, son of Zaccur. From the tribe of Simeon, Shaphat, son of Horah. From the tribe of Judah, Caleb, son of Jephunneh. From the tribe of Issachar, Igal, son of Joseph. From the tribe of Ephraim, Hosea, son of Nun. From the tribe of Benjamin, Pelati, son of Raphu. From the tribe of Zebulun, Giddal, son of Sadi. From the tribe of Joseph, that is the tribe of Manasseh, Gadi, son of Susi. From the tribe of Dan, Amiel, son of Gamil. From the tribe of Asher, Sethor, son of Michael. From the tribe of Naphtali, Nahabi, son of Vasvi. And from the tribe of Gad, Gula, son of Maki. These were the names of the men Moses sent out to spy the land. And Moses changed the name of Hosea, son of Nun, to Joshua. And Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, and said to them, Go up there into the Negeb, up into the hill country, and see what the land is like, whether the people who live then there are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, whether the land they live in is good or bad, whether the towns that they live in are unwalled or fortified, whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are trees in it or not. Be bold. Bring some of the fruit of the land. Now it was season for the first ripe grapes. So they went up and spied out the land of the wilderness of Zin to Rahub near Lebo Hamath. And they went out into the Negeb. They came to Hebron and Amianin and Shishi and Tamali and so on. Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. And they came to the wadi of Escale and cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes and carried it on a pole between two of them. And they also brought out some pomegranates and figs. That place was called Wadi Escol because of the cluster of the Israelites cut down from there. And at the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. They came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the Israelites in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregations. They showed them the fruit of the land. And they told them, We came to the land which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. So just imagine the people are gathered around. They're waiting to hear with bated breath about this land that God has promised them. And they see the fruit. You can hear them go, Okay? Yet the people who live in the land are strong. Towns are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the land of the Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites live in the hill country. And the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan. So the people give a version of what they see as there are some big people out there with some big fortified cities, and they look strong. So you go from, yeah, it's got a lot of fruit and milk and honey, but it ain't going to be easy to get it. But Caleb quieted the people. You can hear them just talking. We're not ready to go fight. We're not ready for this. We're not ready for that. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, Let us go at once and occupy it, for we are all able to overcome it. And the men who had gone up with him said, We are not able to go against this people, for they are stronger than we. So they brought to the Israelites an unfavorable report of the land they had spied out, saying, The land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people we saw in are of great size. There we saw the Nephilim. The Anakites come from the Nephilim. And to ourselves we seem like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. So they're essentially saying, listen, we don't have a chance. They're giants compared to us. We're like little grasshoppers to them. After hearing this, so just imagine, if you had to get a report over the next 10 years to a group of people on what's going to happen or what could happen. And you could give a positive report or a negative report. How oftentimes does negativity and fear motivate people more than the other?
Very afraid of the unknown.
Yeah. God can inspire the people to move forward. But oftentimes fear motivates people differently. The whole congregation raised a loud cry. The people wept that night. And all the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron, the whole congregation, Would that we have died in the land of Egypt, or we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become booty. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? So they said to one another, let us choose a captain and go back to Egypt. Can you imagine, after all they've been through, to decide it would be better just to go back? After all God's done for them, after all God showed them, after all God has provided for them. Let's just go back. Get rid of Moses and Aaron. Let's pick somebody else to take us back. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before the assembly and of the congregation of Israelites. And Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. And to the congregation of Israelites, the land that we went through as spies is exceedingly good land. And if the Lord is pleased with us, He will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are no more than bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, but the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. But the whole congregation threatened to stone them. And the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people despise me? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs and I have done among them? I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them. I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. But Moses said to the Lord, then the Egyptians will hear of it. For in your might you brought up this people from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of the land, they have heard that you, O Lord, in the midst of this people, for you, O Lord, are seen face to face. Your cloud stands over them, you go in front of them, and pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. Now if you kill this people all at one time, then the nations who have heard about you will say, it is because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land He swore to give them, that He has slaughtered them in the wilderness. And now, therefore, let the power of the Lord be great in the way that you promised when you spoke, saying, the Lord is slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children, third and fourth generation. Forgive the iniquity of this people, according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you pardoned this people from Egypt until now. Moses stands before God and says, very bravely, much like Abraham before Sodom and Gomorrah, trying to change God's mind. Listen, God, if you kill these people here, this is a story that they'll tell. That the God of the Israelites freed them from Egypt, promised to bring them to the promised land, but you know what? He couldn't do it. What kind of story is that about you, Lord? Moses motivates God to continue the story, to continue the journey. Just after the Sinai experience of the idol, God's ready just to start over. He says, no, you have said you are a God slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. Let's see you practice it. Pretty bold. Pretty bold. Then the Lord said, I do forgive, just as you've asked. Nevertheless, as I live and all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the people who have seen my glory and the signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have tested me these 10 times and not obeyed my voice, shall see the land I swore to give to their ancestors. None of those who despise me shall see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit, and has followed me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. Now since the Amalekites and the Canaanites live in the valleys, turn tomorrow and set out for the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. And the Lord spoke to Moses, to Aaron, saying, How long shall this wicked congregation complain against me? I have heard the complaints of the Israelites, and they complain against me. Say to them, As long as I live, says the Lord, I will do you these very things I heard you say. Your dead bodies shall fall in this very wilderness, and all of your number, included in the census, from 20 years old and upward, who have complained against me, none of you shall come into the land in which I swore to settle you, except Caleb and Joshua. But your little ones, who you said would become booty, I will bring in, and they shall know the land that you have despised. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years, shall suffer for your faithlessness, until the last of your dead bodies lie in the wilderness. According to the number of the days which you spied out the land, 40 days for every year, you shall bear your iniquity, 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. I, the Lord, have spoken. Surely I will do thus to all the wicked congregation gathered together against me. In the wilderness they shall come to full end, and they shall die. The men whom Moses sent to spy out the land, who returned and made all the congregation complain against him by bringing a bad report about the land, the men who brought an unfavorable report about the land died by plague before the Lord. But Joshua son of Nun, Caleb son of Jephunneh, alone remained alive of the men who went out to spy the land. So can you imagine hearing your fate because of your distrust, because of your complaint against all that God has done? You're going to be stuck wondering. Whole generation, 40 years. Your children, under 20, will get there. They're going to be old, but they'll get there. To hear that and then to read it and hear it in Babylon. The prophet Jeremiah tells those that are being deported to Babylon, it'll be 70 years before you are able to come back. To know that part of you is looking towards a future you will never see. Your body will die and be laid in Babylon. It's not coming home. Your children, and probably your grandchildren, are going to live their lives in captivity. To hear that and to know that there is another generation that was in a similar predicament. It hurts, but to know that the children get to go home, to have a home, to have a land. That's at least something. We're going to stop there. We'll pick up following this story onwards. We'll continue journeying with the Israelites through the wilderness. One wonders how Moses and Aaron must feel at the moment. I mean, it's not far. We had the opportunity.
All we needed to do was just shut up and go forward.
You know, think about in your life where you've had opportunities and you missed them. How long does it take to get back to that opportunity again?
Sometimes it never comes along again.
It doesn't. It might be your children or your children's children. They get that opportunity.
You know, it's just hard to believe that here these people were eyewitnesses It's not like it was their great-great-grandfather. These people were living it. They were eyewitnesses that was what was happening and the benefits they were receiving firsthand. And then still have the nerve to complain and turn against when, you
How
know,
many people in
it's,
the, could have said God actually came down and talked to us?
yeah,
He was present in our everyday life.
there he was, right there.
We read this story and it perplexes us. And then we read the story of Jesus and we see Peter and the disciples, and they've experienced all that Jesus has done. And Peter's even gone up to the mountain and a cloud descends, and Moses and Elijah are there.
Oh, yeah.
They've seen Jesus feed multitudes of people. They've experienced Jesus as he's healed people. And even still, they're only able to follow Jesus so far. I mean, it's the story of the journey of faith. Sometimes it's not until we get to the other side of Easter. It's not until we get to the promised land.
Sometimes I think our fear overcomes our faith.
Yeah. You know, most of us don't have to get in those life or death situations to make those choices.
But we feel like it is.
Sometimes.
Sometimes it's like, it's going to be the end of the world if I don't do this or that.
Yeah.
I can't. I don't know.
Yeah.
It sounds like, yeah, you were saying the fear. Like, why did they send the 12 people to scout out? You know, why didn't they just follow the pillar of cloud? You know, like maybe there was fear there. And,
And
you
just
know, like
all
when
of,
Peter, like, walked, was it Peter that walked on the water? And he
Yeah.
took his eyes off God, and, you know.
Yeah.
yeah, we just watched the thing, the Gospel of Matthew on Roku. And they were doing where Jesus went into the boat.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how 12 people fit in those little boats. It was so realistic,
Yeah.
showing Jesus and what he was doing in that day. I was just amazed,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
and especially with the
yeah.
feeding. And when he started out, he didn't start out with a huge amount of people. It just kind of grew
It
and
grew.
grew and grew.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I was like,
it was really well done.
Mm-hmm.
And they really stuck to the
to the Bible.
Bible.
Because
Yeah.
everything spoken was spoken from the biblical writings,
It was actually Matthew as an old man
telling
telling the story, and the two, what do they call them, scribes, were writing it down as he was telling the story of his life.
with Jesus.
It was really well done, yeah.
Yeah.
But I relate to what you were saying about the complaining. Take a handful of young GIs out on a mission in the jungle and listen to the complaints. So I didn't send you here, Uncle Sam sent you here. I'm just in charge here. You know, and that's probably how Moses felt, you know, and wait a minute, I'm, you know, God's the one that's in,
Yeah.
I'm just here relaying the message.
Well, and you think, you know, somebody like Moses goes to Pharaoh, and you would think, okay, this is the hardest it's going to be,
Yep.
just to get the people out.
Yeah.
And it's not. The people themselves become as much of an obstacle to their life with God as Pharaoh was.
Yeah.
Or maybe they were more of an obstacle because they had a choice. Choose to believe and go forward,
Yeah.
or choose to complain and want to go backwards.
Yeah.
You can't go forward and backwards.
And the very people that cried out to God to save them are the very people that don't trust God when God offers them new life.
Even though God was with them the whole time, they saw him.
Yeah.
And I do think that, you know, when we think about these stories, Israel, its life and its experience sees this story being played out over and over again. Over and over again. Let me close this in a word of prayer for those that have joined us online and those in person. And we'll meet again next week. Gracious God, we thank you again for today. God, we thank you that you meet us where we are. That, like Moses reminded us, you are a God of steadfast love and mercy. God, in our lives, sometimes as we follow, we have doubts. Maybe things aren't going the way we exactly wanted them to go. Maybe your timing is not really our timing. And internally and externally, we may complain. God, forgive us. Help us to see where you are leading us through your Spirit. And let us hear the voice of Jesus as we heard this past Sunday, calling us to follow. Lord, our life of faith is a journey. It's one that never really has an end until we are all together with you. So we pray that you will continue to lead us individually and as a church. We pray this in the name of Christ our Lord.